So since I did this podcast a few years ago, or my friend, the co-author of Baphomet, the Temple Mystery Revealed, interviews me, I feel the need to preface it with some things. This is my 2020 addendum to the discussion. My approach to knowledge is somewhat odd in that I learn some of the basics within an area of study, and then I go far out to the fringes, slowly working my way back inward. This affords me a unique perspective on things, but it's probably a bit strange and unorthodox to most people, and it occasionally means I miss a few crucial elements along the way. As a methodology, it has its boons and flaws. One main source for this talk was Kurdish scholar Mehrdad Yezidi, but since this recording I've learned a lot about Mithraism and read the works of Payam Nabars and Jason Reza Jorjani. It's now abundantly clear to me that the Yezidi and Kurds are Iranians, as mentioned in the interview, possibly descended from the Medes or Medians. Let me stress that, but clarify what that actually means. I went on a date with an Iranian-American girl once. She told me she preferred that I refer to her as Persian, though I would later discover that we were both confused regarding this. People from Iran and the Iranian empires throughout history called themselves Iranians. Westerners started referring to them as Persians, which are really only one of the multiple Iranian peoples or tribes. Because of outside imperialists interfering with their nation, Iranians started to utilize the invaders' terminology. So they began referring to themselves as Persians in this unconscious manner, and sometimes get offended if you refer to them as Iranians. Bit of a mindfuck. Anyway, that being said, I still think that in the case of the Yezidi, while they are Iranians, there are other genetic and cultural influences there. Mesopotamian, Elamite, and possibly even Indian, or alternately some pre-Aryan culture that we either don't have a precise label or name for, or something else maybe. Most likely their culture represents a deep level of fusion between Aryan and non-Aryan cultures. I get into why later, though it makes more sense in the context of knowing about a vast Iranian empire that spanned the whole region. I highly recommend Jorjani's book, Iranian Leviathan, to have a better grounding in that topic. I describe the Yezidi as xenophobic, but frankly, if anyone deserves to be, it's them, after what they've been through. Also, at the time I made this, my understanding of geopolitics was not as sophisticated or developed. I'm now aware that while the recognition of Kurdistan might seem good in the short term for Kurds, it's not good in the long run. A reunification of Iranian peoples across a large territory into a greater Iranian empire would be more of a just and sustainable system for all of them. A new region of Kurdistan would just be manipulated by the West and its allies, just as the Kurds are now, in order to use it as a staging area to attack and balkanize Iran in an upcoming conflict. I don't share the Abrahamic beliefs of my interviewer, who is an Adventist turned Gnostic scholar, but it probably is confusing for the listener that I seem to have Gnostic tendencies or sentiments, even though my religious background is in a non-dual tradition. I should make it clear that this is simply based on personal experience. Astral encounters I've had with what appeared, or more importantly felt to me, to be the Demiurge and its minions. I may go into those in some detail at a point later down the road in another video. My spiritual journey throughout life has been sort of a series of tortured vacillations between non-dualism and dualism, theism and atheism, or scientific rationalism, punctuated with periods of agnosticism. You name it, I've probably been down that alley. I guess I fundamentally don't have a ton of strong beliefs surrounding aspects of spirituality, and I've increasingly taken a sort of chaos magician's approach to belief in general. These days, I turn more to philosophy and empirical methodology in this area. A couple of corrections, just so you're aware. The Yezidi refer to themselves as Ezdi or Ezidi. I'm not sure why in the West we call them Yezidi or Yazidi. At one point, I meant to say Rex Mundi instead of Rex Deus. And as this was my first podcast interview, I was nervous and kept mispronouncing Anunnaki for some reason. Concerning the presence of heavenly or star cults existing concurrently or before the Greeks, there certainly were, such as the Sabaeans and Taoists, and I made it seem for a moment as if there weren't any before them, though I do think that their conception of that concept possibly could have arisen somewhat independently, or perhaps it was through Persian or other outside influence. The Ali Hawk people use the word hawk in a different context than truth, so that doesn't exactly mean what I described. It's a bit complicated. In terms of the Iranian influence on Buddhism, it's far more extensive than I understood at the time, possibly at its foundation. But that's definitely a subject for another time. As far as the Mazdakite influence on Gnosticism, it also might be quite fundamental for it. Regarding the connection with Crowley, I was entirely wrong about this. There's a whole blog post about it that I will link in the video description. And as far as Peter Lamborn Wilson goes, aka Hakim Bey, I was not at all aware at the time of recording this that he is in some kind of like pederast cult. So please keep that in mind. And I mentioned some religious cults that may or may not be associated with the Yezidi. This was according to my sources and speculations at the time. It was a fundamentally speculative enterprise to a degree. A people this skeptical of outsiders are going to be inherently misunderstood. Though after I did my research, I did encounter some rather expensive theological books online that seem to go into more detail than I have here regarding the Yezidi religion. That's a project for another day when I can devote the funds to it. I also neglected to mention that the Yezidi conceive of Melek Taus in one sense as Gabriel, the Archangel, though he's a much more complex figure, as you will come to discover. And there's some other connections with the Slavic people I could have explored regarding their New Year's traditions. Possibly there's other stuff I got wrong too that either would take too long to address or that I missed. I'm also now aware of the blue avian theory of certain dubious disclosure peddlers, UFO disclosure, and while it's a bit out there or seemingly silly, it does seem to have some affinity with the subject in hand here. So I will post a link in the description. One more thing about the theories within. You may get the impression that I somehow favor a Lemurian origin of Earth's religious and other history over an Atlantean one or Hyperborean. That isn't the case at all. At least not anymore. It's just where this particular research led at the time. I may do talks about other antediluvian or hidden civilizations. In fact, I already did to some extent when it concerns the Vril in my other podcast with Alex. It's highly likely that Atlantis was an Aryan civilization. A lot of things point to that, as well as with Hyperborea, and I intend on getting into that, as well as the topic of the enigmatic Scythian peoples of Central Asia, the Durkasthai dragon lord culture from that region that Nicholas de Vere, the Fairy King, wrote about from his own family lore, believe it or not. And perhaps I'll even touch on the wacky so-called Tartarian conspiracy in other talks. Some of the slides contained within were from a group research project I was involved in a long time ago in college. The fugly slides are not mine, but in the interest of time I kept them. Other images are simply relevant things I found. You'll notice throughout that I have a tendency to revere or appreciate the Titanic rather than godly figures. I've struggled with this affinity throughout my life because of its inherent taboo, but I've finally come to a point of acceptance with it. The gods are, for the most part, not our friends. Not only that, but after reading the works of Jason Reza Giorgiani, I've come to realize at heart that I have always been a Promethean. On a more personal note, this podcast was taken down for a couple years after the author Alex, who interviewed me, dealt with some things that can only be described as spiritual trauma after his co-author Tracy's death. And if you know anything about her and her cavalier approach towards spirit communion, this may have led to possession, and there's a lot of rumors and whatnot that may or may not be true, but he felt the need to remove any and all occult connections or influences from his life at this point in time. I didn't bother getting it put back up because I had some lingering bitterness surrounding finding out that my shit from this talk was actually plagiarized by a certain author from Down Under. He took some of my research that I put out pseudonymously years before this interview and put it in his book. That was pretty crappy to find out. His book was actually a bestseller in the occult field, and he made a good bit of dough from it, so I do not appreciate that. Fuck you, mate! At least it was a lesson learned, perhaps maybe not to put out anything that isn't easily and obviously copyrighted. Finally, a message to the Yezidi people. I hope this podcast has portrayed your people in a good light, and I sincerely apologize if I got anything wrong or misunderstood an aspect of your culture. I mean well, and I only intend on spreading awareness of your cause. Okay, enough rambling. Enjoy.
Welcome to the Megadeth Aeon podcast, where the light of Gnosis destroys all ignorance, and what you thought you knew, you didn't.
Welcome to the Megaseon podcast with my friend today on January this year of 2017, whereas Miguel Connor would say this year of our Demiurge. So yeah, I mean, I'd like to introduce you to my audience. What we're going to talk about today is the subject of the Yezidis and Melek Taus. Now, I'm just going to ask you point blank. Or a little bit also about you, about your background. Like, who are the Yezidis, and who is this figure known as Melek Taus, and how did you come to get interested in this topic?
The Yezidis are a Kurdish people from the northern parts of Iraq and Syria, and they practice a really unique religion, which at first appears to be kind of like a mishmash of indigenous Mesopotamian religion, Zoroastrianism, Judaism, and Sufism. They're a very insular people. They're endogamous, sometimes even xenophobic, because they've undergone a lot of genocides and other kinds of persecution over the years, especially recently. Along with other Kurds, they desire for the ethnic geopolitical region of Kurdistan to be recognized as a sovereign nation. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened yet. So their religion is, it's like a mixture of Indo-European and Semitic traditions. And it's actually associated with a broader tradition called Yazdanism, or the cult of angels. This cult really spans from different parts of Iran to Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, and it probably originated in the Zagros Mountains. The Ali-Haq, or people of truth, are pretty much the only remnant of this cult in Iran, and there are a lot of similarities with the Yezidi, even down to their temples. They're topped with like this sort of cone structure with ridges cut into it. And then in Turkey, there's a subsect of Alevism called Chinnarism, and this is also a part of this tradition. And even the Druze in Syria and the Bahaism is loosely associated with it. Essentially, all these groups believe in a transcendental God and a heptad, 7 emanations, or benevolent beings which sustain universal life and govern worldly affairs. This Persian Anglican cult is likely responsible for many of the trends in both Shiite Islam and even Manichaean Gnosticism. I even think that it may have made its way into the Catholic clergy quite a long time ago through the avenue of Mithraism. So back to the Yezidi. That's kind of a long-winded way to come back to, just to give you an idea of their roots. So their center of worship is at Lalish, and it's near Mosul in Iraq. And like Zoroastrianism, their temples have a large gateway topped with a sun symbol. And like the Mithraic cult, they who used to do, before their religion kind of went to the west, they practice a yearly bull sacrifice, which is interesting. So Melek Taus, or Tawusi Melek as they refer to him, is the chief angel of their religion, and he's not actually God or the creator, but he is the primary agent or vessel of creation in their tradition, and he's the main focal point of worship. He's known as the Peacock Angel, and he's the governor of these 6 other subordinate angels. The Yezidi god created a pearl on which the Peacock Angel rode. And after this, their god, who they call the Invisible One, essentially retreats from action. And their origin story kind of reminds me of the Orphic egg myths in a way, because Melek Taus uses the 2 halves of this pearl to create the world and the 7 heavens. And he creates the animal kingdom, including man. And because of reasons we'll get into later, he's not unlike a fallen angel. As far as my interest in the Peacock Angel, it came about sort of circuitously. I've actually been to Kerala in India to see my family's guru a number of times. This surprises a lot of people, but despite being a Western whitey, I was born into direct path Advaita Vedanta, which is basically radical non-dualism via my parents. And I actually had my first birthday there in India, and I've been there 8 times from like age 1 to 17. When I was down there in this little village in Kerala, I noticed that there were peacocks everywhere, just freaking everywhere, strutting around on rooftops. And a few years into going there, I noticed that they had a shrine dedicated to snakes. It's like essentially this walled off concrete patch of lush jungle about the size of 2 houses, and people aren't allowed inside, which is pretty weird. This wasn't just for safety reasons. I think it was almost seen as like a metaphysical or spiritual barrier. I was too short at the time because I was a little kid, so I never got a proper look inside, but it was really interesting. Basically, down there in South India, they venerate serpents and peacocks, just like the Yezidi do. And what tripped me out is, here we were part of this really transcendental, not particularly superstitious type of Hindu tradition, and yet we were completely surrounded by this ancient atavistic consciousness, like bursting with life all around us. And so this peacock and serpent connection really struck a chord for me when I first heard about the Yezidi. It's like this really cool religion that I can never join because I wasn't born into it. So I ended up doing a bunch of research and partly drawing on the books of Mark Amaru Pinkham. His stuff is interesting, and he really goes out on a limb, comparing Melek Taus to practically every ancient god or adversary figure. Some of it's, definitely a stretch. Some of it's legitimate. One of his ideas, I think it's a little too absurd for me, is, his Melek Taus' story is the origin of the Christ myth. That's pretty out there. While, he is technically he's the son of God, this is probably going a little too far. The guy is a New Ager, and he runs like 5 secret societies that he created. And
Who's this again?
Mark Amaru Pinkham.
Okay, right. Okay.
Yeah, and it seems like he's pretty comfortable with cultural appropriation, and I suspect you might have some kind of axe to grind. Just as many ethnographers who encountered the Yezidi in the past have, and I guess he tried to connect the Peacock Angel to the end of the 2012 Mayan calendar date, and he had all these like mystery school workshops that seemed to con people out of a bunch of money. And
wow.
I've followed his stuff on like Facebook, and I mean he does do a lot of outreach to try to create awareness for the plight of the Yezidi, and he's like trying to raise funds and stuff, but you have to wonder about ulterior motives. So
right.
I kind of take everything he says with a grain of salt.
Doesn't he have a group called the Gnostic Templars, or the Gnostic Order of Templars, something like that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, exactly.
Interesting.
So, yeah. I mean, I really like a lot of his stuff. He brings a lot of interesting ideas to the table, where you can go and do deeper research and kind of find out if half of it's true. And there is a decent that does ring true when you sort of fact check it, So, I got into this whole Peacock Angel thing for quite a while. Back in 2011 and 2013, I was like really obsessed with it, and I gave a presentation on it and everything. And I even had a poster of him on my wall for a while, which honestly I kind of realized after the fact was maybe a little bit presumptuous. I actually had to take it down. I have this scalar wave generator device. Mm-hmm. It's almost like a really souped up orgonite pyramid, but it's attached to like a power supply, and what it does is it basically amplifies any energies present by a scalar factor, and it essentially manifests energies. And it was right under my poster of him for a little bit, and one night I felt like I basically experienced like a psychic attack. Like my brain was being like painfully, violently invaded. And right as it happened, I noticed this like multicolored peacock feather eyes in every direction, and it was pretty weird, I gotta say.
Wow.
I think this entity needs to be approached with, proper respect and skill for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you sent me your presentation, I thought it was really fascinating because a lot of it has a lot to do with what I was researching for this Baphomet book that I co-wrote with Tracy Twyman, and a lot of it, what you're saying in this this PDF, this file you sent me, has really intertwines with what I've been researching for this whole time. Like in our book, we talk about how Baphomet is like this almost kind of like almost a demiurge figure to these Templars. Mm-hmm. And if you, he's such a complex figure. I mean you can't really just pigeonhole him to just one particular concept. He's probably the most complex symbol I've seen. And when you look at the Peacock Angel of Melek Taus, he's kind of the same way. And you have Melek Taus, who's kind of like this demiurgical figure in a way. And I know I'm going to be a little controversial with this, but he almost sounds like Yahweh in a lot of ways, especially how he describes himself in a thing in the Yezidi book. So I just thought it was kind of interesting, the correlations with that, because the way he says he created the world, or somehow he was involved in the creation of the world, and he blesses all those that believe in him, because the Yezidi people are in a covenant, are pact with this God.
Right.
Now, when you look at the Jews, the Abrahamic faith, they're always in a covenant with Yahweh, right? So, in Henotheism, and I talk about this in this recent article that I wrote for my website, is the idea that, you recognize there are other gods out there, but you decide to choose one specific God to be connected with. And if you look at the Old Testament, there's all these constant warring against these other gods and these other nations, and then even like Yahweh is just basically just one of these many different gods, and El Elyon is actually the highest god, right? And actually corresponds with Anu of the Sumerian Anu, and there's a lot of similarities with Anu and Yahweh. It's just kind of interesting there, but I don't want to get too much into that. But I want to kind of go into like who is this Melek Taus figure exactly, like, and why is he like called a Peacock Angel? Like, what do you think about that?
Melek translates as both angel and king from Hebrew, and Taus or Tausi means peacock in I guess Kurdish, or I think they speak Kurmanji, the Yezidi, which is like a branch of Kurdish language. Also is just sort of a pop etymology. It reminds me of the Tao cross and its astrological association with Saturn, and as a symbol of like finality. There's probably nothing legit there. It was an interesting synchronicity. The Peacock Angel was likely associated with this multicolored bird as a way to signify his dominance over the realm and over this realm and over nature and beasts. And I think the many eyes of a peacock's tail feathers are a symbol of Melek Taus's omniscience. He witnesses all. Nothing in our realm escapes him. And culturally in the West, we associate the peacock with ego. It struts around. It's very proud and loud. It's looking quite beautiful and seeking out mates and being kind of domineering. In the tradition of alchemy, the peacock stage is associated with a true consciousness of the astral body. And it's a dangerous stage because, here's where the illusions of the ego can potentially completely take over. It's seen as like a sort of a false conclusion based on pride if one stops the work there. It's not the final stage of the magnum opus. The refracted prismatic colors of the rainbow are of this world, not the next world, which is made of, undifferentiated white light. And I think this is where the spiritual ego takes hold if one is not too careful, and if one has one has to progress further, to fully undergo philosophical death and be spiritually, psychologically, and to some extent physically reborn in the phoenix stage, which is almost like a higher octave of the peacock. It seems like the peacock has become a worldwide symbol in general. That was one of the most interesting things looking into Pinkham's work. He really gets into that. Like across the world, for whatever reason, maybe because of the Fisher King's peacock feather-brimmed hat and the Grail mythos, kingship is associated with peacock feathered crowns and heraldry. And there were courtly traditions in medieval times surrounding a feast where a peacock was presented to the court. The Japanese Buddhists even have a peacock tradition, which may have came about due to an early Zoroastrian influence on Tibetan Bonpo. This chimeric sort of griffin figure known as Simurg, which is an amalgamation of a peacock with a dog's head and lion's paws, made it all the way out there. Interestingly, he's an enemy of dragons, just as peacocks physically eat snakes in the real world. The dynamics between animals and Zoroastrianism point to a dualism there, which maybe in some way the Peacock Angel resolves somehow. Even the Amish have a peacock tradition, and even as far away as in the Amazon, shamans have crowns filled with peacock feathers. Maybe this symbolizes the assumption of certain worldly powers, or something to do with conquering the ego, or even fully accepting the ego as a necessary, thing to perform kingly functions. I don't know, but you see the symbol everywhere, both in the West and especially in the East in Hindu and Buddhist iconography. It's almost like the peacock crown is a symbol of the ego becoming a modality of the enlightened being rather than the state by which it's dominated. That's just my interpretation anyway. So.
Yeah, so isn't the rainbow symbol sort of a kind of a symbol that is associated with the occult, like you travel to the astral world or something like that? Like, what's your take on that?
Definitely, I know that at least in Western alchemy and in Tibetan Buddhism, there's this idea that when you've in the West, if you found the Philosopher's Stone, you have this ability to go into the astral and be fully conscious and even take that ability into death. And, in Tibet, it's known as the rainbow body. So it's kind of like in, a lot of people have tried to pick apart the Egyptian, religion and figure out like what they meant by the Ba and the Ka. And, when pharaohs or certain figures were able to figure out how to marry those two aspects of the soul and the spirit, what comes out of that? Like, what can they accomplish? And I guess part of it is being fully conscious in the astral, but it's also being able to retain your memory and basically yourself through death.
It's kind of interesting that symbol, the rainbow, is also associated with gay pride, right? So they're kind of using it like an occult symbol. So I don't know. I just think that's kind of interesting correlation there.
Definitely.
But yeah, I mean, so I guess my next question has a lot to do with how Melek Taus correlates with what, in the Bible. I mean, they only mentioned him once. It's called Lucifer, but of course, the morning star, or the light bearer. I mean, it's also, that title is associated with Jesus Christ in Revelation. So I'm just wondering, so what's your opinion on that? Like, how does Melek Taus correlate with, both Lucifer and Jesus Christ? Like, what's your opinion on that?
That's a deep question. So, other than sort of the false light or incomplete light vibe that I was alluding to earlier, I think the connection here is indirect, just as it is in the biblical tradition with Lucifer's identification with Satan, according to the popular interpretation. Melek Taus has more of an association with Satan and Iblis in that he would not bow to Adam when he was created. While Muslims and other people of the book revile Satan for this transgression against God, the Yezidi actually admire his independence and sovereignty in that action. And even though the Yezidi are forbidden from even saying the word shaitan, I remember reading an interview with a Yezidi woman where she basically admitted that, yes, they are one of the same, but that he's a greatly misunderstood figure in the Abrahamic religions. And unlike their Arabic neighbors, the Yezidi genuinely revere him. In the Mashath Resh, one of their purported scriptures, Melek Taus is listed as one and the same as Azazel, who, as we know in the book of Enoch, basically gave man technology and the means to live as anything other than total barbarians in this world. In this case, though, this might be an example of Islam or other outsiders not totally understanding the term properly, as in the text it actually appears variously as Israel, Anzazel, or Aziz in various translations, which that last one means something precious, rather than, I think Azazel means like the strength of God or something. I forget the translation, but this was probably transformed into Azazel because of the familiarity with that name in those traditions. And Melek Taus is also believed to be Dumuzi, the son of Enki. And as I'm sure you know, sometimes Enki is interpreted as another Promethean figure who got in trouble for ensouling man, essentially.
Right.
Otto Rahn, the Nazi SS officer who was obsessed with the Cathars, actually thought that the Grail was a stone that fell from the Peacock Angel or Lucifer's crown as he fell from heaven. And I think that Melek Taus is one and the same as Rex Deus, the king of the world that the Cathars believe ruled this world, and the one that Rene Guénon wrote so much about. I think it's important to note at this point that the only known Yazidi sacred scriptures are basically forgeries or creations of outsiders trying to understand them. That makes the subject a bit hairy, for sure.
Really? Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's that makes it pretty challenging, but as far as like, I talked a lot about how he's related to Lucifer in a sense, but as far as Jesus, I mean, I think that connection's a bit shakier in terms of Yazidi, but I remember, reading in Pinkham's books about how he thought that all this iconography of the Catholic Church came from this cult of the angels or the Yezidi somehow. He pointed out the connections of Mithras to Christ and how basically they took a bunch of stuff from that tradition and kind of matched it on to what they were doing. And I watched this video of this guy on Buzzsaw talking to Sean Stone recently about how he thought the Flavians basically wrote the Bible. And,
I think you're talking about Joseph Atwill, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And who knows? I don't want to get too controversial about the whole Jesus thing, but it as someone who didn't grow up in that religion, it does often seem like, at least in some sense, he was a constructed figure, or that a lot of the stuff that's attributed to him was taken from other things. But it does seem like there was an actual historic Jesus. And anyway, I'm getting off topic.
No, that's fine. No, I mean, I was just curious of what you thought of that. And by the way, Azazel or Zazel is I think it means scapegoat or something like that, because he's mentioned in Leviticus.
Yeah.
Right. As the Jews were supposed to sacrifice a scapegoat or goat to Yahweh, and then another to Azazel, right?
Yeah.
And this,
exactly.
and the whole idea of these serum demons that come from Azazel. Now, if you look at in the Kabbalah, Azazel is sort of like an intermediary, or even a progeny of Lilith and Samael, and Lilith and Samael, they're also considered like these beings that took the form of the serpent and that mated with Eve, and actually gave birth to Cain, the line of Cain, and Tubal-Cain, and I mean the whole Cain bloodline, who were like the originators of agriculture and human civilization, seem to come from these two beings, according to the Kabbalist tradition. And of course, if you look into Freemasonry, they talk about how the Masons kind of come from this bloodline of Cain, and then Cain is associated with the Demiurge Yaldabaoth and the Gnostic scriptures, and kind of the same thing happens too with Yaldabaoth, and he impregnates Eve, or he rapes Eve, and then she gives birth to Cain and Abel, and they're kind of like these animal-faced creatures or archons. I don't know what you want to call them, demon archons, whatever. But yeah, I just think it's really fascinating how far he can go with this. I mean,
definitely.
Yeah, I mean, of course, so you look at what Azazel is associated with. He's a scapegoat, and you look at how Jesus is also considered the sacrifice or the sacrificial passion over the sins of the world and the fallen man, and it's just interesting how they kind of correlate too. Yeah, I know I'm going that way. I'm going in that direction.
I like it.
Yeah, and then if you look at with the church fathers, how they reported a lot of these Gnostic beliefs, and saying that Simon of Cyrene was he took on the passion, and then Jesus escaped somehow. He was laughing. Yeah. He was laughing at the ignorance of the archons, and then Simon's taking a beating. He's like, oops, I'm out of here. And then, if you look at, the Gospel of John, it's just also kind of interesting. Jesus actually invokes the devil to actually possess Judas, to actually sacrifice him. They're just really strange. Like, what? Like, this is actually in the Bible?
That's wild, man. I didn't even know about that.
Yeah, you actually read it. It's actually in the Gospel of John. Now, and also if you look the Yezidi, now how I mentioned earlier the Melek Taus, he's like the same as Azazel, and how he's also kind of similar to Yahweh in a few ways. Like, now this is very much consistent with how a lot of Gnostic groups, like the Sethians, the Yophites, they claim that Yaldabaoth or Saklas or Samael was the same god as Yahweh. So. And also in a way, like if you look at the god Sabaoth, I mean, I talked about him earlier in another podcast, but he's like the good demiurge, quote unquote, and he's also kind of the same as Abraxas in a lot of ways too. He kind of I think in one of the texts he repents of his sin of following Yaldabaoth, and he sides with Sophia, and he becomes like the good Yahweh, right? So. In a way, I think that like the Yezidis, they kind of revere Melek Taus as a good demiurge, and it's sort of like an envoy of the supreme god or El Elyon. So, and even if you look at like the Shiite mother of books, it talks about how Azazel is like sort of like an arrogant demiurge figure like Yaldabaoth. So, and
check that.
Yeah, and, it's really interesting. And a lot of people don't really talk about it, but I mean, we kind of hinted that in the Baphomet book with Tracy Twyman. But and then if you look at Job, the book of Job, I mean, it also says that Satan is actually the brother of Yahweh. He's one of the Elohim. Yeah. So I mean, just so, it's really interesting how far you can go with this. But anyway, but speaking of Satan or the devil, so how does and how does he, or the Yazidis and Melek Taus, how does he correlate with Aleister Crowley and what he believed in? So, what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, so, when the Book of the Law was channeled, Crowley was told that Aiwass was one and the same as the quote-unquote the god of the Yazidis. Just as a side note reminder, he's not actually their god, but anyway. Mm-hmm. In Crowley's eyes, this gave Thelema legitimacy and connection to an ancient Mesopotamian tradition. Certainly just reading the text, I mean, Aiwass seems like an awful lot like a war god. And as Melek Taus is seen as kind of cognate with the South Indian war god Kartikeya, this is interesting. I think we'll get into that a little bit later, but there's a figure that Crowley was really keen to meet and apparently looked up to quite a bit, Gurdjieff, and he drew from the Yezidi tradition as well. He traveled all the way across the Middle East and Eurasia, and his fourth way system of development was supposedly given to him by the Sarmun Brotherhood. Their teachings were similar or even identical to a Circassian tradition called Amsta Kebsa, which is known as Caucasian yoga sometimes. And this too seems to be derived from Zoroastrianism. Along with the Tibetans and Egyptians, Helena Blavatsky believed that the Circassians were the inheritors of lost Atlantean knowledge. So there's definitely some interesting stuff there. I mean, who knows how deep the Crowley thing goes. I just know about that one reference in the Book of the Law. This ancient people also worshipped a similar or identical figure. I think it's kind of an attempt to create like a sort of boutique Satanism and making it seem more interesting, and by basically appropriating exotic, ancient, ethnic ideas. I think this first started with LaVey. I'm not sure about that. And then I've noticed that this guy, Michael Ford, has written quite a bit about that. He's trying to get out that concept that there was like this satanic version of Zoroastrianism. And, honestly, I don't think there's a ton of substance there, but it is what it is.
Right.
I will say that Mark Pinkham had an interesting point that the devil is Kundalini, and I have noticed that this idea has been propagated more and more since his books came out. It kind of makes sense, being that Kundalini's, this trapped energy in the base of the spine, and it ascends or is risen to become complete or integrated. Shiva and Shakti marrying inside the brain. Kundalini is this energy that needs to be resolved, and in a way, too, the devil needs to be redeemed or resolved. There was this secret society in London, supposedly started by a Syrian Yezidi man, and I guess members would whirl around this peacock statue in a trance, and they supposedly worked with the peacock and serpent powers, which they labeled as the powers of increase and construction, which kind of reminds me a lot of Kundalini and like Siddhi magical powers that can be attained through working with it. They would basically, whirl around the statue and go into trances and try to manifest certain things in the world and, in their life. I don't know if it's a legitimate Yezidi thing, but I guess it was a thing back in the 60s. All that being said, I don't think the Yezidi are Satanists. Melek Taus isn't their god. They just recognize him as the governing power of this world, and he's the most imminent connection to a transcendental god who they refer to as the Invisible One. The god of the Yezidi isn't anthropomorphic. It's more like a universal spirit. So I definitely don't think they're Satanists, and I kind of question the legitimacy of a genuinely satanic tradition connected to these people.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting that you bring up the Kundalini, because a few other people kind of mentioned this to me, but I haven't really had much of a time to really research in depth about Kundalini. But there's just one guy, I think his name is Jose Aragon, but he wrote a book called I think it's like Primordial Knowledge or something like that. But he was just saying that the Kundalini in each person is basically like a demonic force controlled by the Demiurge, and how we're all supposed to like fight this creature inside us, this demon.
Yeah.
And now, if you look at this other guy, I think he's a little less credible, but of course he's a lot more famous. His name is John Lash. I'm sure you know who he is.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, he says that the Kundalini is something that you're supposed to embrace, that it fights the Archon somehow, and we're all and gives us this divine light by Sophia, because if you look at in the Gnostic text, they say the serpent is really Sophia giving knowledge to Adam and Eve, right?
Yeah.
But if you look, I think it's just in one text. Now, if you look at other texts, though, they kind of disagree with that. If you look at the Secret Book of John, it says the serpent is like a part of the same team of Yahweh, the Yaldabaoth. It's kind of like they're kind of like working in tandem. It's really weird. Yeah, and then now if you look at I'm kind of going back to what I said earlier about Azazel. If you look at the Gospel of Judas, Judas in a lot of ways it kind of is sort of like the scapegoat too. And if you look at the Gospel of Judas, these figures like Yaldabaoth and I think it's another demon creature by the name of Nebro. I don't know, just the way they describe it, it just seems like we're talking about like these kind of the same thing as the Watchers in a way. Because if you look at like the gospel, I'm sorry, not the gospel, the Apocrypha of John talks about how these archons interbreed with the daughters of men, and it's interesting that you bring that up in your article, or at least in this presentation that you gave me, and you talk about how these Watchers or these angelic people were somehow associated with Melek Taus, right? And I think you say that the Epic of Gilgamesh actually talks about this with these birdmen or something. So I mean, what? Like,
oh yeah.
Yeah. So talk about that a little bit. I'm just curious what kind of go on or go into that subject.
Okay. That was kind of my clincher for the big. That was my big moment.
Oh, okay.
Right into that, but
okay.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think there's a lot of correlation with the Yezidi beliefs and Gnosticism.
Mm-hmm.
Gnosticism, like all of Christianity, but especially Gnosticism, has a large, I think, Zoroastrian influence.
Mm-hmm.
The dualism that is typical of Gnosticism is less emphasized there, but as the Yezidi and all other sects of the cult of angels believe in the transmigration of souls, I think that's a chief belief in most Gnostic groups. I'm not totally sure about that, but
mm-hmm.
It seems like that's the case. Their version of it looks a lot more like reincarnation than any other kind of metempsychosis. You already mentioned from the Jewish and Gnostic traditions, we get the story of Adam and Eve, and the Yezidi have their own version of this, and in their Genesis story, Adam is actually the one who sins. He eats of wheat rather than of fruit. And also the Yezidi believe they are descended from Adam only, not Adam and Eve. I'm not really sure how that works out, but maybe they are descended from Adam and Lilith or some other combination of people or beings or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a weird synchronicity, but my history professor told us about how many human diseases originated in Mesopotamia after civilization came about, and the hunter-gatherer nomadic lifestyle kind of gave over to farming and eating grain and living in tight quarters. One of the main theories about the origin of different blood type antigens is that they came about due to the consumption of wheat. This is really interesting, and in a way it kind of reminds me of the Tower of Babel story from the same region, just in terms of
mm-hmm.
disparate blood types, emerging, kind of like the fragmenting of language. And it just made me think of their version of the Adam and Eve story. I think ultimately the main relevance to Gnosticism and Yezidi belief relates to the Demiurge, as you mentioned. What we have here is basically the story of a repentant Demiurge. That's what makes his story so compelling and unique and beautiful, in my opinion. Even though the Peacock Angel created man, he was still subordinate to the Invisible One, the Yezidi God. And in his not bowing to Adam after what he deemed to be a botched or unworthy creation, this was an act of defiance for which he became fallen. And in their mythos, after his fall, he spends 7,000 years weeping in repentance for this act. And his tears quench the very fires of hell. And so rather than like a fallen angel, the Yezidi see him as a forgiven one.
Mm-hmm.
That's really interesting to me. It's almost as if we get a new glimpse into our Judeo-Christian traditions, as if there's like more to the story. It's kind of like how Aeon can be seen as a Christed or anointed version of the Demiurge. Their Leontocephaline and Serpentine iconography is practically identical. and yet one represents the awakened version, containing all the powers of the cosmos, and the other is Saklas or Yaldabaoth, the blind, ignorant fool,
Right.
I think what we're dealing with here is the symbol of an awakened devil, kind of like how Baphomet is almost like a balanced or hermetic aspect of the devil.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, maybe the devil has multiple aspects, just like people do, like an id, an ego, an oversoul, etc. The story of the Peacock Angel actually made me want to try to understand the Demiurge better as a being or a force. Maybe with any god or spiritual figure, the idea of temporality comes into play in terms of, their past, current, and future existence or aspects. There's a Satan before and a Satan after the fall. Mm-hmm. And so I think here, there are probably different aspects of the devil that people connect to or reject. Kind of like the anthroposophists have like this tripartite devil. They have Lucifer, Ahriman, and Sorath, and their conception of Lucifer is like this false light character, and he wants to create this endless dream realm to entrap everyone in. Ahriman wants to utilize technology to make our reality more demonic and harvest souls, and Sorath just wants to fuck everything up and to obliterate the cosmos. There's different personalities and slices of temporality, and I think people basically just relate to or reject these different aspects, and I think that's what's going on here. Just like a figure like Set in Egypt might be redeemable, but Apep is not so much. He's the Egyptians were like, fuck that guy.
Right.
And Set wasn't always a sinner. So in his previous form, he was just the brother of Osiris, and he had certain aspects to him, and then he fulfilled his sort of black destiny, I guess, to be this sinner who kills Osiris and does all this stuff. But there's a Set before and a Set after. Actually, recently I wrote a mystical text for my Kabbalah class called The Born and the Unborn Gods, where I tried to empathize with the Demiurge for the first time. This possibly hypothetical being that I've genuinely, vehemently hated for many years.
Right.
One that I feel like I've actually encountered at least 3 times in the dreamscape. It was an emotional process writing this thing, and the way I was able to relate to this figure in some way is that just like us, in creation, the born God is ultimately alone. Mm-hmm. No one is more aware of this fact than him, and the metaphysical distance between him and God causes this anguish and, weighs upon his soul. That is, in terms of the Yezidi version of this, not so much the blind fool, Saklas. Mm-hmm. But, I think this idea has been put forth in Kabbalistic thought before, that Satan was the first created being, and we see that same theme here. If God is truly outside creation in the limitless light, and we nor the first angel can reach him in the pleroma, that's a hard word for me to say. If we are destined to recycle eternally through creation, and then, then perhaps the Yezidi have decided that the closest aspect of God that they can personally relate to is his first creation, who may have, he may be an imminent aspect of God despite being a rebellious angel, the first to sin against God. He is, after all, the manager of this realm we live in, according to them and some others, and I think maybe they're just spiritual pragmatists, or they simply relate to him as a complex figure that didn't get his due in our more well-known traditions of the book. Mm-hmm. Even though the main object of Yezidi veneration seems to be the devil, I like the idea that we could honor the ingenuity of the adversary without glorifying his evil aspects or deeds. I mean, the serpent gave us knowledge, mm-hmm. right?
Right. Well, I mean, there's so many ways to interpret that. What I was just saying that the serpent, he gives knowledge to Adam, right, or Adam and Eve. Now, in the Kabbalistic interpretation of that, basically means that somehow he knew Adam and knew Eve, like sexually, and somehow from the fall, or somehow from interbreeding with the serpent, there was a fall of this primordial pristine state. Now, if you look at Gnostic texts like the Apocalypse of Adam, it says that Adam and Eve were actually these angelic, aeonic beings that somehow they fell to this material existence, and it was done so by this by the Jewish God, or the Gnostic Demiurge Yazdanism and his angels, and they cast Adam and Eve into this shadowy realm called matter. So that's the kind of Gnostic interpretation of the fall. So it's really like, and even if you look at the Ophite beliefs, they believe that kind of same thing, that how somehow Adam and Eve were these light beings, or somehow became trapped in this mortal coil. Now, it's kind of interesting that if you look at Aleister Crowley's works, like the Equinox of the Gods, he actually mentions this, how Aiwass, this demon god that he was in contact with, gave him this book of the law, or Liberal. But he interprets this god as not only a god or a devil, but actually it says that he's sort of like his holy guardian angel, right? Now, if you look at the Yezidi beliefs, and like you said earlier, how you talk about like the oversoul, and how he's kind of like this oversoul of these people, the Yezidis. Now, when they're going back to this idea of henotheism, and like somehow when certain people decide, or persons really, they make a pact with a certain deity. Now, it's kind of the same thing of the Faustian pact, or it's kind of the same thing in Solomonic magic. You're making a pact with a certain demon to get a deed done, right? Whatever blood sacrifice is needed. And so it's just interesting that the Jews do this, the Yazidis do this, the Mithraists do this. All these different, I think almost every tribal culture on Earth has some form of blood sacrifice to a deity in one form or another. So, and if you look at the Old Testament, Moses says we're supposed to sacrifice all these animals to Yahweh, and then Yahweh he likes the burnt smell of animal fat. Or, he
barbecue.
Like, barbecue. Yeah, he's like yummy. So then he tells Noah to sacrifice one of his animals. They'll stay on the ark to him, and just somehow these gods somehow turn carnivorous, almost like vampires in a way. And then you see Jesus saying that you should drink his blood and eat his flesh, and so you can have eternal life. I guess he's saying spiritually, right? Like to drink his spiritual blood and eat his spiritual flesh, but you can almost say that there's kind of a weird sacrificial element to that idea, right? Anyway, so I'm just curious, like, what's your opinion on how the Yazidis, how do they correlate with like other religions like Sufi Islam, Hinduism, and even Zoroastrianism? Like, what do you think about that?
Well, Sufism derives a lot of its mystical ideas and practices from kind of the Zoroastrian remnants that were left after that religion kind of became, much smaller and sort of marginalized by Islam. So I think there's a lot of harmonious or correspondent elements there. The most obvious Islamic connection with the Yezidi is due to Sheikh Adi, who was the 12th century descendant of the Umayyad Caliph, and he was the head of the Adawiya Sufi order, and he was thought by the Yezidi to be an avatar of the Peacock Angel. I couldn't figure out in my research if he actually was born as a Yezidi and he was part of the Sufi order, or if he basically encountered them and realized that there were a lot of similarities. I'm not really sure about that aspect, but basically he reformed the Yezidi tradition, adopting some of the outer trappings of Islam, mostly in an effort to, prevent the Yezidi from experiencing genocide. This did work for a good while, although unfortunately, as you know, we're seeing it again today. Mm-hmm. But the Sufi doctrine of taqiyya is essentially this practice where a group of people decide to take on the outer trappings of another religion, or even a more popular version of the one they already practice, in order to remain safe from harm and undetected. It came from Shia Islam, but Sufis who are Sunni have had to take it on to protect themselves before as well. It's kind of like how many Jews in Portugal and Spain outwardly converted to Christianity as a result of the Inquisition, yet secretly remain crypto-Jews faithful to their religion. Same goes for the Donme, the Sabbatean Kabbalistic cult in Turkey, who actually blended in quite well with the Muslims there. Despite Sheikh Adi being part of the Yezidi culture, I think it would be a mistake to think that the Sufis are necessarily friendly to them. Mm-hmm. I read a pretty scathing article by Peter Lamborn Wilson where he basically disparaged the Yezidis as evil. I usually like his stuff a lot, but I found it to be pretty lowbrow, to be honest, kind of brainwashed, Mm-hmm. Now the connections to Hinduism, as I mentioned earlier, the peacock and serpent worship, and I think that goes a lot deeper. There's this peacock riding god, war god Kartikeya, also known as Skanda and Murugan. This figure Sanat Kumara has been compared to the Peacock Angel. Mm-hmm. There's a really interesting tale of a contest between Skanda and Ganesha for the favor of Shiva, where Skanda lost basically, and in anger he struck Ganesha, injuring one of his tusks, and this caused Shiva to banish Skanda to the mortal world, where he settled at Kataragama, and that totally blew me away because it just sounds exactly like a fallen angel story. Mm-hmm. Apparently, when Alexander the Great's empire conquered parts of Afghanistan, they sent representatives from Greece to check out Sri Lanka and southern India, and they found the Kataragama temple to Murugan and swore that it was the same as Dionysus. They were like totally stunned that this dude looked exactly like their god, or one of their gods, I should say. This is a whole other story we could get into, but those two deities have so much in common as far as their iconography. But anyway, near that location is a mountain known as Adam's Peak, interestingly, and another neat piece is that the Yezidis utilize these 7 sacred oil lamp relics in their ceremonies that they call sanjaks. And I gotta say, they're an awful lot like the ones we used in India when I was there. Save the peacock on top, although sometimes that appears in India too. Not to mention, Yezidi women dress a whole lot like Indian women sometimes when they wear their nicest clothes, and they're wearing what basically appear to be saris. And the fact that peacocks don't live in Iraq, that's not their natural habitat. I watched a video by this Tamil man explaining etymological connections between the two cultures recently, and I can't really confirm or understand half of it. He had a really thick accent, but it really does seem to me like the Yezidi are an offshoot of an ancient satellite civilization from India. I can maybe get more into this when we talk about their origins. But yeah, I mean the connections there are pretty damn interesting, I gotta say.
Yeah, if you look at the Zoroastrian tradition, well, at least according to them, their tradition, their radical dualism, everyone's supposed to make a decision of where they want to go, and who they're going to serve. And if you look at the ancient Sumerian beliefs, I mean, the humans they only existed to serve at the pleasure of the gods, and that after you died, you basically went to the underworld, and I mean everyone went to the underworld, so it's not exactly a like a nice belief system to really think about, but I mean that's what they believed in. It's not really a very thelemic idea, how Thelema, material existence like is so great, it's so wonderful, and blah blah blah. But after you die, well, we'll see how wonderful that is. Anyway, I also want to kind of get into, I mean, it kind of correlates what I just said. What I just said, like, now, are they these Yezidis? Are they older than the Sumerians, the Babylonians? I mean, are they what do you think where they are in this time scale? Because I know people like Gordon White seem to suggest that the Yezidis are actually probably the very first civilization, but I mean I'm not really sure about that. But go ahead.
Yeah, this is the really juicy part. So their calendar, it goes back 7,000 years. On the sort of crest or shield that the Yezidi typically use to represent their religion, there are a number of cuneiform writings, notably the Dingir Sumerian symbol denoting a deity. So, I mean, the general sense is that they at least go back that far to Sumerian times. It's been speculated that they are descended from the Medians, or even the older Mitanni or Hurrian peoples of Turkey and northern Iraq, Syria, and Palestine even. And the Yezidi themselves actually believe that Kurds are actually an offshoot of them rather than the other way around. Kurds are the one who abandoned their faith and converted to Christianity and Islam. There's actually an etymological confirmation of this that I came across once, and it was written by a Yezidi woman, and I wish I had written it down. I don't remember what it was, but it gave an interesting confirmation that, they consider themselves to be the original Kurds. So what you were asking about earlier, so the oldest known human settlement and ritual sites of Catalhayuk and Göbekli Tepe may actually be remnants of their culture. Andrew Collins is one researcher who has suggested this. There are a number of birds and serpents everywhere at Göbekli Tepe, and it's in the same region where later temples have been found, such as the Temple of the Seven Planets at Sagmatar, which is near Haran. Perhaps, their seven angels are associated with the seven planets. It certainly seems that way. It would make sense given what we know about the other cultures in the region. You have to wonder if, like, the Sabian star cult was just another offshoot of the cult of angels, or if they're somehow intimately related. And certainly the Chaldean current that we get from that part of the world must have come from it, or a similar culture. they too have been suggested to be a satellite culture from India living in Babylon as well. And, Neoplatonism and Hermeticism owe plenty to that current specifically, for sure. So the real kicker for me is an account of that was in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And this is what you mentioned earlier, where a legion of birdmen are described as the original gods, preceding the Anunnaki, including Anu himself, the great father sky god. These birdmen were banished to hell, and they became minions of Erish Chagall. And to me, this dynamic recalls the struggles between the Asuras and Devas in Hindu mythology, and the Aesir and the Vanir in the Nordic mythos. Maybe the Anunnaki had artworks created of them appearing to be birdmen to adopt the power and legitimacy of a previous culture and sort of like graft it onto themselves. We know this is a common practice in so many cultures throughout history. I personally never resonated with the Anunnaki, even though I've always kind of dug aspects of Sumerian culture, and I think I found out why through this investigation I did. Also, this is kind of an interesting side note, but did you ever see this movie that it was a prequel to the Exorcist movie, where it like depicted this ancient statue of Pazuzu, another Sumerian birdman?
Right. I mean, I seen the original Exorcist, but I didn't see the prequel. But go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'm not a huge fan of those movies, but this one in particular was pretty cool. In this movie, he's, in that franchise, he's basically the chief demon that they reference, and who, fucks with the people in their story. But in that movie, they depict the Vatican as knowing about this ancient birdman tradition, and they actually have a really ancient statue of Pazuzu in the bowels of the Vatican Library, and they've been keeping it a secret for however many hundreds of years. And it was kind of alluding to the idea that this ancient Sumerian birdman religion was like the original religion of mankind. So that was an interesting reflection from Hollywood of, a similar idea to the Peacock Angel. And, well, I'm going to get a little woo on you here, but
yeah, go ahead and go woo all you want. Woo all you want.
I personally, sweet, thank you. I personally think that this religion might be a relic of Lemuria. In India, they have a name for the westernmost continent of Lemuria in their lore. They call it Kumari Kandam. And it's thought by some Tamils to be the original cradle of civilization. It's where the 7 Kumaras supposedly ruled, which sounds a lot like the 7 angels we've been talking about. Mm-hmm. And this ancient continent supposedly connected southern India to Madagascar and Australia. It's basically, if Lemuria existed, it's basically Western Lemuria, whereas, the one you typically hear more about in the woo literature
yeah.
is, it's more like the Eastern Polynesian Lemuria and, Far East in the Pacific. And, as crazy as this idea is, there's a story in the Ramayana about a land bridge connecting India to Sri Lanka. And it's built by Hanuman and the Varuna army in service of Lord Rama, in order to invade the kingdom of the demon king Ravana, because he kidnapped Rama's wife. And it's this whole long epic story in the Ramayana. And even though it's just a myth, there, if you actually look at photos and satellite imagery, it confirms that there used to be a land bridge connecting those two places. Another crazy synchronicity is it's nicknamed Adam's Bridge.
Right.
So, my gut tells me that the Yezidi have the oldest religion in the world. Save perhaps like animism or shamanism. Is it something I can ever prove? Probably not, but, it's just wild that there's all this really kind of, when you think of the cultures in Iraq, in general area of Iraq, I mean, they, this is so much different. What they believe in is in some respects is so much different, and just their iconography and the different aspects of their culture, just, they almost seem like an alien implant, into that region.
Well, it's interesting if you look at the writings of Zecharia Sitchin, and for all his, all the stuff that he got wrong, I mean, he makes some good arguments, but at the same time, I think he tends to confuse a lot of things, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Like if you look at, for example, Anu, and he connects Anu. He connects Ea or Enlil with Yahweh, but I don't think that's. I mean, if you look deep enough, I don't think that's correct. It's actually Anu is actually more similar with the Canaanite deity El or El Elyon, and also very similar to Yahweh too. Now, if you look at how the Gnostics interpreted Yahweh as this demiurge figure, he's basically like kind of like an imposter god. Now, if you look at the figure of Enki, he's like this benefactor. He's the one that gives this primordial knowledge to man, the divine fire. He's kind of like a Promethean figure.
Totally.
And then he's also, and if you look at the iconography of Enki, he also connects to John the Baptist too in a lot of ways, which is kind of weird, because John the Baptist is kind of like this wisdom god archetype where he fits into that category. He's the one. He's like Aquarius. He's the one who baptizes. He baptizes Jesus.
Yeah.
So he's immersed into the divine wisdom, the baptism of wisdom. So I think it's all connected, and then of course it's also connected to the Mercury, and how I think in Hermes Trismegistus he's kind of similar to John the Baptist in a lot of ways. He's also a wisdom god. But anyway, I mean, I just think it's interesting how a lot of these all these different gods they always seem to be vying or trying, in competition over us somehow.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you look at, and then Anu Yahweh, he's like the king of heaven. He's always he's very wrathful. He's always full of contempt, even for his own his worshippers. I mean, he's always going to war with he's always chastising Israel. He's always pouring his wrath on his enemies, in the Canaanites or the Moabs or whatever. I don't know. It's just really interesting, just the way the more you study history, world history and its religions, it just seems like it's kind of the struggle between not only light and darkness, the oldest tale in the book, but it's also like a struggle between order and chaos. And this chaos, if you look at the Apep, and you look at all these different chaos gods, like Leviathan, and Yahweh's always struggling with the Leviathan creature, and then you look at the Canaanite god Baal. He's always struggling with Yam. It's kind of the same thing. So I don't know. I just think it's all pretty. I think it's pretty fascinating. But anyway, I want to kind of get into my last question.
So can I say something before you move on?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you speaking about that and earlier about the underworld, it made me think of this thing I've been reading. It's by Juan Culianu, the Romanian guy who wrote a lot about Gnosticism and ancient religions and stuff. And it's actually his dissertation. It's called Psychonodia, and he writes a lot about how the Greeks and other cultures, basically at a certain point, they turn this whole underworld sort of theology into, they translated it into the heavens. They basically projected it outward and skyward because, like the oldest versions of that don't really have they don't have the most redeeming qualities to them, like you were saying. Like basically, you go to the underworld and you're screwed.
Right.
I mean, there is the story of Inanna going to the underworld and getting rid of the 7 veils, or it's like she goes through these 7 gateways where she's torn apart by demons, and she has to give up something of herself. So, there's definitely something there. There's like that 7 step sort of program, you could say, but it doesn't really, it's not clear if that idea was, in ancient times was available to worshippers. Like, was that part of their actual practice, or, it seems like it was just part of the priesthood, basically reenacting that saga on their ziggurats, and basically everyone else was just a bunch of fucking peons, and but yeah, it seems like at some point the Greeks, or I think it was the Greeks, they kind of translated that underworld theology into passing through the heavenly gates and basically on the way back to the source or the pleroma or whatever. There's many different versions of that, but they kind of turned it into this more redemptive idea. So anyway, that made me think of that.
Yeah, and what's interesting too, if you look at, I know you mentioned the Greeks, if you look at, Kronos and Saturn, and of course, he has a lot of similarities with Yahweh or Jehovah. Now if you look at the Greek and Roman mythology, you see how, Saturn devours his children out of fear that, one day they would surpass him and usurp his throne, right? Now the Saturnic cult, they have this weird obsession with ritual infanticide. I've come to find, and I don't want to bring up all the stuff that's happening.
Oh boy,
happening as of late in the news, Pizzagate. But it's just interesting that all these this is coming out, but yet this practice of eating children, goes all the way back, all to the ancients. To the beginning of human civilization, really. And if you look at Anu and how he also tries to, or I think he's successful in that he usurps the throne of another god. I think it's oh boy, I think I'm forgetting the name, but anyway, I think it's something like Alalu or something like that. I don't know. But anyway, it's just interesting that Anu also struggles against another predecessor. So this divine genealogy, you always find one god, usurping a previous god, and a previous god, so they can take control of the world, and basically, like they're guardians. So I don't know. I just think it's really fascinating. But anyway, I'm kind of get to this last question. So, what's concerning what's happening in the Middle East, like, do you think the Yazidis, do they have a fighting chance of surviving? Like, what's going on there with Islamic State and Daesh and, what in Syria and all this chaos? But what's your thoughts?
That's the heavy question. They've been through some unbelievably gnarly shit the last few years, especially back in 2014. I read recently that their indigenous population was essentially reduced to half, in Iraq and Syria, and through the recent genocides and immigrations, and ISIS and other groups basically, they murder the men and then they take the Yezidi women and they rape them or sell them as sex slaves or keep them as sex slaves.
Mm-hmm.
And then, they either sell or sometimes rape and kill the children. I think you mentioned they behead the children, which is fucking crazy. I can't even.
Yeah.
I think because of all the stuff that's happened to them, I stopped doing my research for a long time on this whole subject because I just couldn't handle how nasty their plight has gotten.
Mm-hmm.
It's really hard to fathom the kind of pain and suffering these people have gone through now and in the past. And the good news is that Yazidis are quite adept at surviving and thriving despite all the struggle. Just this last year, the largest Yezidi temple ever created was built, or is still being built, I'm not sure about that, in Armenia, where there's a thriving Yezidi community. That country actually has a long history in contact with Zoroastrian culture, so it's probably a good fit. There are some decently sized communities of Yezidi in Russia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Nebraska here in the States, and Canada as well. And I've even heard of some small groups surviving covertly via taqiyya, which we talked about earlier, in places as far west as Morocco and Algeria, even in Sudan. Who knows if that's true, but it's interesting. So despite all the incredible shittiness that they've been through, I think that they have a fighting chance of continuing onward. So.
Yeah, and it's really sad. I mean, I know you said that you just didn't want to research the subject, and I was kind of the same way. I was more researching the Yezidis and Melek Taus this past month. I was just researching what's happening to them now, and it just gets so depressing. You look at, I read one report of how these ISIS people fight jihadis. They're like, they force children to listen to their mothers being raped. I mean, it's unbelievable what they're doing out there. And it's funny, well, when people say that Melek Taus is the devil or whatever or what have you, now it's interesting that if you look in their religion, they say that it's forbidden to actually say the devil's name, right?
Yeah.
So why would they do that? Like, why would they say the devil's name if they really worship the devil? I don't know. It's just interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tricky.
No.
I mean,
mm-hmm.
Oh, go ahead.
No, yeah, go ahead.
It's like they really, in Melek Taus, they see a really different personality than we've ever been exposed to
mm-hmm.
in the West, or really in, I think, just about anywhere in Judeo-Christian tradition, or Islam for that matter. And they're certainly the minority in terms of looking at it that way, but I think they definitely had a similar view as some Gnostics, or at least they attempt a more nuanced approach to the whole problem of good and evil, and
mm-hmm.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, I kind of feel like they view the Yezidi god Melek Taus as kind of like how the Gnostics view Sabaoth in a lot of ways, because he's kind of like the redeemed archon, the redeemed cosmic creator in a way. You see how Melek Taus, he kind of repents to the supreme deity or God somehow, and you see the same thing with Sabaoth, how he repents to Sophia, and he's called the Lord of Forces, and he actually rules over these seven heavens, and Sophia is like in the eighth heaven, or Agdawad. supposedly. But I mean, that's just how I kind of view that subject. Now, a lot of people who haven't researched this kind of stuff might be like, "What? Who? What?" But
yeah,
but
all these names are really
like confusing. What's like Sabaya? What? No, but no, I don't want to insult people. But no, it's just I just think it's really fascinating. But anyway, I just want to read this little passage from this. It's a book called Devil Worship: The Sacred Books and Traditions of the Yazidis. Now, their sacred scripture is called Al-Jilwah, the Revelation. So anyway, I'm just going to read a little bit of it. It's kind of a long passage, but I'm just going to read only like 25% of it. So here it goes. I lead to the straight path without a revealed book. I direct aright my beloved and my chosen ones, my unseen means. All my teachings are easily applicable to all times and all conditions. I punish in another world all who do contrary to my will. Now the sons of Adam do not know the state of things that is to come. For this reason they fall into many errors. The beasts of the earth, the birds of the earth, and the fish of the sea are all under my control of my hands. All treasures and hidden things are known to me, and as I desire I take them from one and bestow them upon another. I reveal my wonders to those who seek them, and in due time my miracles to those who receive them from me. But those who are without are my adversaries, hence they oppose me, nor do they know that such a course is against their own interests, for might, wealth, and riches are in my hand, and I bestow them upon every worthy descendant of Adam. Thus the government of the worlds, the transition of generations, and the changes of their directors are determined by me from the beginning. So it's kind of interesting to how Melek Taus, he's in control of not only the Yazidis, but many governments of the world, it seems like. And now if you look at the gospel,
it's like the ultimate archon or something.
Yeah, some kind of transcendental archon that we don't even have a category for. It's weird. And then if you look at how Azazel is described as like this arrogant archon and the Shiite mother of books, or if you look at even like the Bible, you look at Paul, he talks about the God of this world, or the prince of the world that was cast out according to Jesus in the Gospel of John. I mean, they kind of seem a little bit similar, but at the same time, Melek Taus, I think, transcends all these titles and names. I mean, it's like a god that you can't really put in a box, really. It's just really hard to define, in my opinion. But I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, personally, since I didn't grow up in the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's pretty hard for me to resent the figure that God supposedly cast out eternally for one bad decision. It's kind of like Jesus, but yeah, I mean, he's this really interesting figure that doesn't seem to fit any of our traditional categories or viewpoints that we tend to draw from, or conclusions that we make. So I totally agree, man. It's a really interesting figure.
Yeah.
Just the part about him having influence over the worldly rulers, you wonder, is he still pulling the strings?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not sure about that. I mean, a lot of his people that revere him, and they're undergoing a lot of trials and tribulations.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to say that what they believe in is wrong or false or whatever, but it's kind of like the whole. I mean, it kind of goes back to this idea, like why do bad things happen to good people? So
yeah,
that's the age-old question. But anyway, I mean, I'd like to thank for you to coming on. I mean, do you have any last words you want to say to all our listeners out there?
Oh, well, I just want to thank you for having me on, man. It's been really fun. Hopefully I didn't just babble on too long, but it was cool to hear your ideas, and I really like your work. You know, it's got academic rigor without being pretentious, and I really appreciate that, because a lot of kind of academic stuff is pretty, you know, it can get pretty pretentious. And
yeah.
I think it's cool what, you know, people like you and Tracy, there's more and more people out there who are starting to realize that topics like, you know, the occult and conspiracy research aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. And, you know, I think in the past people have kind of tended to treat, you know, one or the other group as just totally absurd and full of it. And it's cool to see more people kind of touching on those two areas and realizing that there's something legitimate in both categories, you know. So.
Yeah. Thank you so much, man. I mean, I really try to be accurate as much as possible. I mean, I like to cite things appropriately. I like to read things without putting my biases on them. I mean, as much as possible. I mean, I probably, you know, a lot of my stuff, I mean, that might seem like I'm not as particularly pious, but no, but I think, you know, I do believe in God in, you know, a lot of ways, you know, and I kind of consider myself sort of a Gnostic Christian, but at the same time, I don't want to just disparage other beliefs. I think all these religions, all the myths, I think are pointing to something, and something really interesting, and I really hope to talk more about that on my blog and perhaps on this podcast in the near future. But I'd like to thank you for coming on to my show, and I hope maybe another time you can come on again.
Absolutely, man. I would love it.
All right,
Thanks
great.
so much.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, man.
All right.
See you.
Have a good night.